Welcome to Betrayal Trauma Recovery. I'm Anne. It's summer, and I remember being so excited, thinking my marriage would improve as we spent quality time together on that road trip or family reunion. If you end up having the same experience I did, where vacations left me feeling more hopeless and scared because I found out on one of those trips that my husband was using explicit material and lying to me about it. We're here for you every day, all summer long. You don't have to schedule an appointment or wait. You can hop on one of our daily group sessions from anywhere. We're an empathetic team of betrayal trauma professionals, and we can help you right away. Our daily group session support is the safest space for women to focus on their healing without fear of being traumatized by a therapist or clergy who might seem to think that you're part of the problem. You're not, and you're not alone. If you're ready to join a community of women who truly understand, check out our group session schedule at btr.org/group. We'd love to see you today. And if this podcast has been helpful to you, subscribing and leaving a 5-star review is the best way to help other women find it. Follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Together we can reach every woman who needs to hear this. Heidi Hastings and Rebecca Lucero Jones, two researchers, are back on the podcast today. They're going to share the results of two studies. The first is how women's religiosity and spirituality were affected by their partner's porn use, and then the results of when they studied how a partner's porn use affected a woman's sexuality. Their research revealed some very interesting things about online infidelity, otherwise known as pornography use. I picked out 7 things. I'm not going to point them out as they're sharing. So as you're listening to them share their research, hopefully you can hear these themes. Number 1, sometimes his porn use is just the tip of the iceberg. Because of the psychological abuse of altering your reality, you might think he's telling the truth because he's telling you some of the story, but later you find out more of it. Number 2, this has happened to many, many women. You are not alone. Number 3, it's not your fault that he's using pornography or that he's chatting with women online or any other thing that he could be doing related to his quote-unquote sex addiction. Number 4, it's really important to learn what it means to be psychologically safe. And essentially, that means that you're around someone who is telling you the truth and you're not living in their manufactured false reality. Number 5, self-care is extremely important during this time. And number 6, learning effective safety strategies, emotional safety strategies, psychological safety strategies is key. And that's what the Living Free workshop is for. To get more information about that, go to btr.org/livingfree. So Heidi and Rebecca, you studied how women's religiosity and spirituality were affected by their husband's porn use. Can you share what you found?
So as the belief was taught to them that the husband was the leader in the home, they felt unsettled looking back on it, how that had actually put them at risk, or they'd given up their whole identity to serve him. And gender roles also within religion were disturbing to them, that their role as a woman, as the wife in the home, was really dismissed. There was a participant named Tracy who also was looking at gender roles in scripture, and she referred to the story of Queen Esther in the Old Testament. She said, "It's not just the theme of strong women and saving the Jewish people in Persia. To me, the biggest theme is men have always behaved badly with male entitlement, and that has been very destructive to women." And another was the women decided to stay in the marriage because of their religion. For some women, that was because they had honored their marital vows. They were trying so hard to keep their part of the vows, regardless of what had happened. And staying in the marriage for the sake of religion didn't mean that they were healed or that they had a positive marital relationship. A lot of them stayed in the marriage and they were sleeping in different bedrooms or on different stories of the house to make things work economically and to keep their vows in what way they could. But there were some women who were grateful that they had stayed in the relationship because of their commitments to their religion, because they were able to heal the marriage eventually. The length of time since their discovery varied from 9 months to 2 or 3 decades. And some that had been living with this issue for a long time still had terrible marriages. We really had a wide variety of outcomes. About a third stayed married and were happy with it. About a third stayed married and were not happy with it. And about a third were divorced.
That answers my question, because a lot of times I'll interview them and they're like, I did this program. It was incredible. He's doing great. Our marriage is better. And then they'll come back 3 years later and say, oh my word, he was lying to me the entire time. It was all grooming. And now I found out something else. I've also found when a couple goes to therapy and they think that they're successful and the therapist thinks they're successful and it's like, oh, awesome. And then they don't go to therapy anymore. And then if she does find out he was lying that entire time they were going to that particular therapist, that they don't go back to that same therapist. So then they go to a different one. So that therapist would never know that actually he was lying the whole time and manipulating. They usually don't circle back around to the same people that they sought help from in the first place. They usually move on because they think like, well, that didn't work.
Yeah, as a therapist, it is really tricky when working with any type of infidelity or deception because you don't really know if people are telling the truth. And there are many times I have been lied to. It would be embarrassing to come back to the therapist and admit that you've lied. And it could be the husband doing a power play to not go back to the therapist.
Yeah. Over 7 years, we went to about 4 different therapists. But I think that going to multiple therapists is common. Was that a question in any of your studies?
It was not, but several of the women brought that up, that they had gone to therapists that were not helpful, who didn't understand betrayal trauma, who blamed them, or they felt just disconnected from, and that was more harmful. And so they talked about switching therapists multiple times without me asking anything about that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the other things that was big in the women really wrestling with their religion was unmet expectations of religious leaders. So they thought that the religious leader could fix the problem. You know, all he needed to do was go talk to his religious leader and somehow it would be fixed. They thought that the religious leader would at least hold him accountable and were really disenfranchised when they didn't feel like that happened, when they were let off easily. And who knows if he told them everything or just minimized it. They were given poor advice often by religious leaders who did not understand the woman's perspective of betrayal. And they felt like there were dismissive attitudes quite often. A woman named Ruth said, a bishop has got to be able to get him to stop and tell him that he can't do this anymore. Then everything will be okay. Nicole said, my religion didn't give me the tools that I needed to be able to put my foot down earlier. This is my marriage too. You don't get to be the authority on me if you're acting in sin. A religious leader that tells me I need to have sex with my husband more, and that's how I'm going to help him stop using pornography, is not speaking Christ. She's not speaking the Bible. She's telling me the story that she was told.
Whoa. Did you just say a woman religious leader?
Uh-huh. Yeah, we had several women that had women religious leaders.
And they weren't better, huh?
Not when they were speaking from tradition. This finding is those who were wrestling with religion, who'd felt overlooked, ignored, dismissed, silenced by a leader. The resources all went to her husband rather than resources going to support her. Rather than the leader meeting with her regularly, it was with her husband. So there was a sense of disenfranchisement with the expectations that they had of their religious leader, which they then often would project onto the religion. And they're like, I don't know what I believe anymore. Not all of them, but definitely some of them. And then they had these challenges to their faith where, because their religious leader they felt was linked to God or called by God, they pulled away from their church, a few of them, not a lot of them. One woman changed several times. She started out as a fundamentalist Christian, very, very, very fundamentalist conservative. Her pseudonym is Colette. She said, I was promised by all these people in church that your virginity is the best gift that you can ever give to your husband. Like, such bullshit. And I don't swear. That's a quote. And she was like, I can't believe how what I was taught to serve, to do everything for him by the leader, by her husband, put her in such a dangerous place. So she changed religions several times. Another woman, Esther, said, we pulled away from the church. I really didn't pray or look to God for anything. Serafina said, I don't go to the synagogue anymore. That loss is profound. I have so many rabbis and cantors with problematic pornography and sexual behavior as clients, and she's a therapist now. She said, it just feels so hypocritical. Rituals are very important to me. What isn't important to me is sitting and listening to a rabbi. Those who really struggled with religion and left religion was a smaller percentage of our sample, but several of them really struggled with multiple aspects of religion based on those things. Rebecca, do you want to take the next theme?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a few different aspects of healing and what kinds of relationships were helpful. This is really key because when a woman is experiencing betrayal trauma, a lot of times women would first seek guidance from religious leaders rather than secular sources. And I think a lot of this is based on the assumption that if you have a shared belief that viewing pornography is a sin, that you would get better support. And if you go to a secular source, that they may not share that belief with you, that your partner's, use of pornography would be harmful to you. So it was important for them to be seeking support from someone who shared that, I would say, worldview. And what we found was that those professionals and religious leaders who really tended to the intersectional nature of these women's identity, meaning that their female identity was not the only identity that they had, but also their religious identity, that it was really important that they understood what it meant to have both of these identities at the same time, right? To be a religious woman, and that tending to both of those aspects of their identity was really critical to being able to help these women heal. And also, I would say, find their own power. So one area that was really important was support from inside the religion. So we talked about how sometimes religious leaders didn't meet expectations, but when women did have a religious leader who was able to be helpful to them, that was really key, right? If they could show compassion, empathy, and validation, this ended up being a very safe place for them to share their experiences. It's really important that religious leaders be able to show compassion and empathy when a woman comes to them and shares that this is happening in the marriage, right? That her partner is having extramarital sexual behaviors, and she a lot of times doesn't quite know how to interpret what's happening. We had one woman really share this beautiful response that her rabbi had. Tracy shared, she, meaning the rabbi, took me to the mikvah. There's a river that flows out of the Garden of Eden. And when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, they were so disconsolate and so despairing. They went and sat in that river weeping. The mikvah is the sacred immersion in the living waters that flow from the Garden of Eden and can be used anytime you want to reconnect to sources of renewal and creation. After the pollution that had happened to me, we went to the mikvah. There are very specific prayers. You must be completely naked. You're immersing yourself back into the waters of creation for purposes of rebirth and renewal. That was wonderful. And so we really loved that story that Tracy shared, because here we see a rabbi really seriously hearing what she has to say and recognizing that this woman was really in need of rebirth, of some sort of renewal, because she had felt so broken by her experience. And so I think that's a beautiful story of how religion or religious rituals can be healing when leaders are able to listen and understand the experience of the woman. The next part is recognizing the need for support outside the religion. So This was also really helpful when religious leaders understood, I would say, the extent of their expertise. When a woman comes and shares this, a lot of times she only knows the tip of the iceberg. She's coming in crisis. So again, she hasn't had the time to really, I would say, process all the things in the history where she may have felt or sensed something. She really, I would say most of the time, doesn't know quite fully what she's dealing with. And plus, there's been concerted effort to deceive her, and she may never know the full extent of what's going on. So when a religious leader gives advice based on just one thing that she shares, women in our study did talk about how if they couldn't accept the statement I said about my partner emotionally abusing me, I certainly wasn't going to tell them about the sexual abuse.
They kind of dip their toe in to see.
Yes, a lot.
If he'll be empathetic about this, then I could tell him more, kind of a thing.
Right. And so those who were met with compassion.
Yeah, so they would test whether or not they could trust a leader. One of the women, Nicole, said that it was really important that she began to understand that what she was seeing with her partner was much more serious than just, oh, I just looked at a website. She talked about her husband's problem and said he had been watching pornography while he was driving, which is why he got in a car accident. He had a total of 5 car accidents, and 3 of them were while he was watching pornography. He doesn't learn. That's why I tell him it's not a sin, it's an addiction, because no person is this dumb. As she began to learn more, she realized this is beyond the limits of a pastor. It's quite dangerous. This finding in particular was really interesting to me and Heidi, and it was that women need women for healing. What we found was that there was a lot of shame when somebody found out that their husband was using pornography. And sometimes some of these women, their husbands had other sexual behaviors that were extramarital. And one of the things that really helped these women was to find older women within their religious tradition. Sometimes they had female leaders, though that wasn't quite as common. Noelle shared that she found older women in the church who mentored her and helped her get through it. And that was one way that women went around the structure in a religion where you see a lot of male leaders. Another one, Betsy, talked about building a support system with multiple women, including a coach, a support group, and friends. So she really built herself a little village of women that could support her. And she said, it was so beautiful to have a woman cheer for me, support me, and delight in my achievements, and just be totally fine with all of my mess. That really just shows the beauty of healing with other women in your corner, hearing other people with a similar experience who have also been on this same journey and learning about how they've navigated their faith, how they've navigated their healing. That is a really key part of a lot of women's healing. One of our participants, Faith, shared, I was just like, somebody understands. And the best thing was I could see that people were farther along in their recovery. I want to die right now, but I might be okay after this is done. That really captures how these groups really give people hope for the future. And as a professional, I think that's really important for therapists to know too, that therapy may not provide that same level of hope that you get in a group setting. So I think encouraging clients to find, it could be online or in-person support groups, can be really important as she moves through this experience.
Which we know that you do, Anne, with BTR. So thank you for your work there.
Our daily support groups. Yes. Yeah.
Totally. Last thing that women talked about in reference to women need women for healing was how comforting it was to think about a female counterpart to the male god that was commonly discussed and worshipped in their own religion. And one of our participants, Tiffany, described how this was for her. She said she started to collect art and study Heavenly Mother, and how that was very healing. Tracy talked about how in Judaism's religious roots that elevate women as equal and a unified relationship with men. She explained some of the words in Hebrew for God combine the masculine and the feminine. The term El Shaddai means breast, and El, a Hebrew name for God, is derived directly from the name of the chief Canaanite male god that was represented by the bull. So you have the merging of the masculine and the feminine, often translated as God Almighty, the compassionate, strong, powerful God, the masculine and the feminine together. It's a religious belief that brought a lot of women comfort to think about this feminine God as someone who could really understand her pain, and that it was very difficult with the kind of the traditional rhetoric in a lot of religions that may not necessarily deny the idea of a feminine God, but often leave it out in the discussions and in terms of what they promote when they talk about God. But it's interesting that a lot of people, even within the religious traditions, that there was some room for some sort of feminine God, and that this was a really significant part of their healing, was turning to this feminine God rather than a masculine God that they often felt wouldn't be able to quite understand the level of pain that they were experiencing.
About 10% of the women that spoke about this, but we felt like it was an interesting enough finding because they came from 3 different religions. I'm just going to read this quote. Colette said, "God is male and female. A group of pastors came here to hear me speak one time, and I made them read from the passage of the creation of Genesis, where it says 3 times, in his image and likeness, male and female, he created them. I said, what does that say about the nature of God? And one pastor said, if that's true, it changes everything. And I said, it is true. And it does change everything.
Sorry. Oh, you've handpicked all the parts of the Bible that benefit you. But these parts, you're like, what? This is new to me? Okay. It's been there the whole time.
And it's a pastor. So we really loved the last theme, spiritual growth, because we don't want women who are just entering into this phase, just starting to listen maybe to your podcast, to think that the pain and the heartache is all that they're going to experience with this. Besides the trauma, when we ask the women, how have you changed? We were floored by their answers. They were not what we thought, but many of the women got really emotional during that question when they started talking about their most intimate spiritual moments. Many of them came with a deeper faith, with strengthened relationships with God that truly transformed them into new people with a new identity, a new, better version of themselves. They felt a divine assistance from God. Sometimes they were very suicidal. More than half talked about being suicidal without us ever asking any questions about it. And often in that moment, they felt God would bring miracles. Some would have dreams or could hear a voice or feel someone next to them. And that just gave them hope and kept them going. They had people come into their lives or resources come into their lives that they've said, I remember driving back from church late one night. It was dark and the tears were pouring down my face. The only way I made it home was through the grace of God and his mighty protection. I felt his presence on my right shoulder, and I remember pleading with God and praying, just take me away so I don't have to feel this pain anymore. And he told me, it's not time yet. It's not time. And she said, God is there. He's watching and he's powerful. So through these personal experiences, the women were able to find meaning in their adversity and experience at least some times of peace. And many, many of them gained personal relationships with God that they didn't have before. Previously, their experience with religion was more focused on the rituals of going to church or reading scriptures, which many of them kept those same rituals, but they deconstructed, if you will, their faith and then built it up again, focused more on God than on the religion. And they used the religion as a scaffolding to help them come to God. They learned to trust God, to seek help, strength, and support.
What percentage of women chose to leave faith altogether from your study?
2. And 1 said she was coming back. Several did leave religion for a time, but then came back when they had figured out their own way to reconstruct it, either by changing religions completely, by changing congregations, by changing places of worship, or by just changing their own perspective of the role of their own religion. Every single one of them found their husband had been unreliable and dishonest, and they could not trust him. And so in many cases, they started looking to God for truth rather than to their husbands. They detached from their husbands and put God more in that central role quite often. They found a deeper need for God. Tiffany talked about her experience with the nature of God just completely changing. She said, I don't even know who that God was that I believed in before, because I have a whole new experience, which is stronger, brighter, bigger, and more abundant than ever. I've learned that the capacity of Christ to know my individual, unique, deep feelings of loss occurred. Hurt, pain, confusion, all the things. It is so real. The last thing that the women talked about in this spiritual transformation was recognizing the spiritual and emotional and intellectual growth changed who they were. Several even talked about being grateful for the experiences they had. Not all the women, but many of them said that those experiences gave them newfound confidence in themselves. They were able to speak, which many of them had silenced themselves. And especially they spoke out quite often about pornography, about betrayal of any kind. Zena said, the biggest thing I've learned is discovering myself. I truly didn't know who I was. I am a child of God. I have worth and I have a voice. And He wants me to use it. I'm not the same person that I was before. I'm a new creation in God's eyes. The women reported also, through all of that personal shame that they had experienced, working through that with the help of support groups and learning to have more grace for themselves, because so many of them had blamed themselves for the whole experience, that they weren't good enough, that they were not sexually adequate enough to keep their husband tied to them. They found purpose in their suffering, and they went on a mission, many of them, to help other women navigate similar trials, which I think you have done. And I love that so much. I just wanted to share one last quote from a woman named Cassie. She talked about taking complete responsibility for her spirituality rather than relying on other people. She said, I had to learn to define faith, taking out all the middlemen and the structure. This is between me and God. While I say that, I still believe in having a church structure. I still see the value in that. But what I thought it was going to do for me is not what it did for me. So I had to learn to take a lot more personal responsibility for that.
I know a lot of our participants said that they were grateful for the experience because of who they ended up becoming as a result of having this life crisis, I would say. I'm not going to negate that that's the experience, but suffering in and of itself doesn't create that person. It's really important that these women understand that they have that outcome because they built that in the face of immense suffering, they chose to see purpose in their suffering, and they chose to find a way to take something awful, the worst thing that has ever happened to these women, for most of them, and to make something beautiful grow from that. And it's really important that the women understand that that is something that they did themselves. I just hate the thought of thinking that we have to suffer in order to become those people, but I think those women always had it in them, and that when they're faced with a crisis, that they were able to cultivate that in themselves.
I thought that for a while, and so many women do. It's like, I deserve this because I was such a terrible person somehow before, that God wanted to give me this, because only such a terrible trial would transform such a bad person like me into the person that He wanted me to be. That's what I would hear. But you were a wonderful person. You are a wonderful person. You didn't bring this suffering upon yourself because you needed to be transformed. You'll come out stronger. but not because they needed to and not because they were weak originally, right?
Right.
Yeah. Like all of my insights are anecdotal from interviewing people for the last 8 years. It's awesome to have them in an actual published study. So you did another study on how a husband's pornography affects his wife's sexuality. So can you talk about the themes that came up in that study?
So when we published this study, we only had a Christian population. It's important to note that it is very traumatic to discover this. Often they've been led to believe that their husband was not viewing pornography or that he did not have a problem with this. And this is very, I would say, psychologically taxing on a woman. She has physiological symptoms, psychological symptoms. A lot of times women talked about not being able to speak for a period of time, like literally becoming mute for a short period of time. They talked about dissociating, feeling nausea, insomnia, suicidal ideation, shame. A lot of women describe it as the floor falling out from underneath them, feeling disbelief and shock, feeling frozen, really questioning what they were seeing. This is a trauma response. All signs point to a traumatic response in their body.
They're not just discovering the porn, they're also discovering his lack of integrity. So they're also discovering
Yes.
that he's a liar at the same time.
Yes. Walking in and seeing the man in the midst of viewing something was very traumatic. Sometimes women are finding garbage bags and garbage bags of pornography, right? So sometimes they're also discovering the sheer volume of what has happened. And that obviously would be very overwhelming for a woman who did not have any inkling
Right.
that her husband was having
Or-
any extra sexual behaviors
Right.
outside of the marriage. I want to share a quote from Zena, one of our participants. She said that on D-Day, that changed everything in my life. It shattered my heart to a million pieces, changed my foundation of what I was standing on. I was in shock. Once you find out news like that, it takes you a while to connect your feelings to your mind. I wasn't able to process that, and rightly, how can you? It was very traumatic, but I didn't react in rage. I didn't quite understand. Why would you do such things? I was at a total loss. It was just too much dumped on me at one time to be able to make any sense out of that. I want to discuss that because I think it's important to understand exactly what it's like for a woman to discover this, to then have the context for what happens to her sexuality. So for some women had intensified sexual desire following discovery. And this increase in sexual desire was described by having 3 primary motivations. One was to control the husband's porn use, one was to protect the relationship, or it was to self-soothe. And so a lot of this emotional response of any of these motivations often resulted in the woman feeling a little bit confused as well. So Tiffany described, even though I was so shattered, I felt this intense sexual desire. Later, I read it's very typical. People will go one of 2 directions, either hypersexual or not at all. So I was like, let's just be together all the time. Then we spent time kind of in cycles based on how much I trusted him until we got to a point where we mostly weren't physical. So we noticed that some women would describe this a similar experience of becoming hypersexual. Now, if you are experiencing PTSD, you are in a high arousal state, an anxious state, and arousal doesn't necessarily discriminate between other arousal and sexual arousal. So to me, physiologically, it is not surprising that women who are experiencing PTSD and a symptom of arousal would also feel heightened sexual arousal at the same time.
I think it's also a form of resistance. And when I say that, what I mean is they want safety and security. That is generally women's primary motivation. They have been faced with this extremely dangerous situation, and the danger is coming from the person who they're supposed to rely on. So it's very confusing. But I just want to give women a lot of credit that they're really genuinely trying to be safe. And they think the safest thing to do is to quote unquote meet their husband's sexual needs. Society has said that. Maybe a therapist, maybe clergy has told her this. And she might be thinking, oh, they were right. I didn't give him enough sex. And that's just the manipulation that these type of abusers tell their wives to get them to have sex with them when they're lying. So you can see how this just becomes more and more problematic.
I think that's a great point. I think a lot of times when we maybe don't have power in a situation, we would rather blame ourselves and think that we have control over an issue than to acknowledge the fact that maybe someone is abusing us. So in some ways, it's like if, oh, maybe this has happened because I didn't have sex with him enough. If I have more sex, I can control this. We hope that we can fix it. Like you said, we hope that we can create the safety we're looking for, because it would be so uncomfortable to think that our partner is not safe. I think it's much more difficult to make the leap to, oh, this person is misusing power against me, and this has nothing to do with me. I think that's like a bigger psychological leap. I appreciate, Anne, you sharing that, because I was just going to share a quote from one of our participants, Samantha, that said, I want to make sure that he gets what he needs from me in that department so he doesn't go looking again. And so you see, that is a lot of women's first reaction. If I give him enough, then he won't need this other thing. And like we talked about in the study on how women's religiosity and spirituality were affected by their partner's use of porn, we also saw some of those beliefs being iterated by religious leaders. You need to have more sex with him. If you do this, he won't have this problem. And so you can see that there's a lot of context for her believing such a statement or behaving in such a way. It's pretty much been programmed in her to think that she is the one that will fix this.
It's also programmed in him. So many men in religious settings are told marriage is the solution to your porn problem. So if you've got a porn problem, you need to get married as soon as you can. And so that's part of the abuse problem. She's just a drug to him. She's not a person. So then she becomes the target of all of his angst if he doesn't feel, quote unquote, satisfied. Because she was supposed to solve all of his problems.
Yes. So the next sub-theme that we had was being shut down sexually. So some women, we talked about having a hypersexual response, and then other women were shut down sexually. When they discovered, they just completely closed off sexually to their husbands, right? They couldn't in no way be open to that. So a lot of times following the discovery, they would say things like, get out, don't touch me, don't get near me. Some women wondered if they were asexual, right? After the discovery, wondering if they'd ever been interested in sex. Other women talked about realizing that the motivation for sex had seemed to always come from a sense of duty. And so we see women really trying to understand maybe a lack of sexual desire after discovering that their husband had essentially a secret sexual life.
Yeah, which is coercion.
Teaching consent is fairly new. Unfortunately, the emphasis on consent is very new. We have a long history of women being obligated to men to please them sexually. Even with a few lessons on consent, it doesn't reverse the social ramifications for not abiding by those like cultural scripts. So now we're going to turn to our second theme. Heidi, do you want to take it away?
Sure. This theme builds upon the idea of the women were struggling with the loss of their sexuality or trying to understand what was going on with their bodies. And it's interesting to look at this perspective from a religious lens, because there's research that shows religiosity actually acts as a protective factor in the development of positive body image for many women. But in the case of sexual betrayal, it did the opposite. So many of the women in our study indicated that their sense of identity and self-worth was completely shattered with the thought of their husband looking at other women. Their thoughts and their feelings surrounded comparing themselves to either what they saw in the pornography or what they imagined might be in the pornography or in the extramarital partners when that was the case, and experiencing shame about their own body. That comparison happened not only for the women, comparing themselves to what they thought the women would look like or did look like, but some of the men would actually say, this is Gwen making this statement. Her husband said, I see you as beautiful now, but compared to pornography, of course not. And just hearing those words devastated her. She said, my world had turned upside down.
Mm-hmm. Well, and can you imagine the psychological abuse before that? She didn't know about the porn or the affair partners. And he was saying, I'm just not into sex because I'm not as attracted to you as I used to be. And so her reality is that she's just not attractive, and that's what's causing him to not want to have sex with her, when she's not aware that he's masturbating to porn, and he can't because he's already masturbated 3 times that day. So even if they tried to have sex, he couldn't have sex. That level of psychological abuse is extremely intense. And wrapping your head around, my husband was willing to let me think that I'm like some disgusting hag, just so that he had an excuse for why he couldn't get an erection.
Right, exactly. That huge hit it took on their body image. Faith was one of the women in our study. She was a middle-aged woman. She said she believed initially that her husband's pornography use was, quote, because I'm old and I sag and I have stretch marks. And Mary, a young Latina woman, said that her struggles with her body image came because she knew she didn't have a model-size body. We did have 2 women in our study who had plastic surgery. One was so sick for so long after that. And the other woman, Anna, said, I don't look at myself anymore. I don't let myself take pictures. I don't think my body is attractive at all. I actually ended up getting a breast reduction at the beginning of last year for medical reasons, and I doubted myself so much because basically he told me he would never look at me the same, and I was never going to be big enough anymore. So like ever since then, I just feel like, I don't know, there's just too many scars on my body. There's too much now for anybody to ever want that anymore. Astra had weight loss surgery, and she said, I can't blame his addiction for my weight problem. That was obviously something I have a problem with, but then I can't blame his addiction for making me have the surgery. But I definitely did have the surgery because I felt less than. I felt unloved. I felt abandoned, and I felt extremely undesirable. So this takes a huge hit then also on their self-esteem. Both of them really struggled after the surgery in lots of ways. In Astra's case, she ended up for 8 years having medical complications related to that decision. And then later on, she found out that her husband had been looking at porn of large women. And she's like, what? I don't get this. Overall self-esteem takes a hit, and they felt like they were not enough sexually. If they had been, they would be able to control the situation. So some studies I've seen show that it takes a woman sometimes at least a couple of years to learn how to orgasm. One woman named Cassie, he was so upset about her inability to achieve orgasm within that first year that he sent her to a therapist to figure out what was wrong with her and what was wrong with her body, because she wasn't satisfying him. And that
she wasn't satisfying him by not having her own orgasm?
That's what he was saying. Yes, that's how he described it. She said, I felt so deeply that rejection of I'm not. It was so directly tied to my sexual performance and so directly tied to my worth and my value as a person and in the marriage. So that sexual rejection, again, you're talking about layer upon layer upon layer of hurt that comes from this. A woman named Faith said, I have this past sexual trauma. I wanted to call the shots, and I wanted to be in charge of my own body and say, it's not okay with me. I don't want to do that right now. But he'd just get so mad, and I'm like, fine, just do whatever you want, which is very unhealthy, and I know that. So her experience demonstrates that women wanted to be in control of their own sexuality, but it impacted their sexuality and their belief about themselves in such sad, really severe ways. Several of them did later identify marital rape and sexual abuse.
I was thinking about an episode I did on wife rape, and in that I talked about a church leader who was giving a church talk about how non-consensual immorality was wrong. And I thought, there's a word for that. It's rape. I think a lot of people are worried about using the word rape because of reporting. For some reason, if you say rape, then it follows that you maybe have to report. And I've never talked to one woman who is even remotely thinking about reporting. They're not going to report. And whether they should report or not is a totally different discussion. But it's interesting to me that other people put the two together when victims don't necessarily. Victims are like, now I know what I'm dealing with. But I think that the reporting thing is what maybe therapists or clergy, what they're worried about. And rather than being worried about reporting, just focus on what happened. It was rape. How would you feel the most safe in your body, in your home? What would you like to do? How can we help you? That discussion is one that I think every woman is entitled to have without anybody thinking, I don't want to say that because then what if she goes and reports it?
That is true. And in addition to that, I feel like for the religious leaders to, at the same time, be aware that it may not just be that one situation. It may be this complex trauma situation that's digging up a whole host of things that often she never told anybody about. Mm-hmm. And so asking questions about that is really important.
What makes it complex? Just go one step further. What was the complexity caused by? People don't quite lean into that because they're like, oh, I always wonder, like, why are they willing to go up to a certain thing, but they're not willing to like logically connect the next dot? They're willing to connect the 3 dots, but there's one more dot.
Yeah, one of the most insidious things about abuse is that in a lot of ways it disconnects you from yourself. It's really hard to trust your gut. So a lot of times you don't believe yourself. So when you get messages, don't believe yourself on whether you know you're ready for sex. Just always have sex when your partner's ready. There's a lot of things happening that really divorce a woman from her own sense of knowing. I'm going to talk about theme 3, which is how women became sexually disenfranchised. When a woman is experiencing that her husband used pornography, a lot of times her sexuality has been prescribed, undermined, or ignored. And her struggle to have her sexual needs met. We've talked a little bit about this already, but the culture scripts, for example, Samantha talked about how she was told, after we got married, he told me with authority that guys need sex a minimum of once a day and other similar things. I was surprised, but figured I'd better show up and meet his need because I didn't want him to stray, especially since I knew he had a history of porn. I thought it was part of my new job as a wife to keep him satisfied. So I think that really encapsulates how a lot of women feel that pressure rather than ever being given space to think about what they may want sexually. A lot of times that's not even a part of the discussion. We had another participant talk about racial scripts. She was a Black woman, and she said, we had to be tough. We were Black women. We came from a long line of women who were abused by husbands and mistreated, cheated on. You had to be strong. You had to be tough, and you had to go out there and do what you got to do. And I want to highlight that Black women in America have survived so much. And in a lot of ways, I'm sure that those messages passed on from mothers and grandmothers have enabled this population to survive. And that in and of itself is something that we have to recognize, that a lot of times there was no other option but to survive, right?
Exactly. It was the best way that they knew how to resist it under the circumstances.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. When you have always been in a context where that's the option to either die or survive, you will choose survival. And again, I think these are the cultural scripts that you're born into. And a lot of times there aren't other options that are outlined for you. So there's just one more quote I want to share about how these cultural scripts encourage that. Anna grew up in an extremely conservative faith, and she talked about what her pastor told her. And she said, our pastor said a lot of times women go into marriage and not like anything and are very shocked with what happens, but you just need to deal with it. And, let your husband do what he needs to do always. Even if you don't like it, you'll end up liking it. You do what the guy wants.
What?
And she said,
you'll end up liking it. That's what people told her.
This is what her pastor told her.
Wow. Wow.
So I think we don't know what everybody's religious education has been, right? But when you have a pastor saying that, you may have men who are having regular, gentle sex.
Her husband, he was very, very abusive.
But even if it's just quote unquote regular, if she doesn't want to do it, it's coercion. It doesn't matter how mild it is, quote unquote.
Yes. But I think it's important for religious leaders to keep in mind that you don't know who's listening to that.
I mean, not only you don't know who's listening to that, that's never right.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
ever. So it should never even be said, let alone who's listening to it.
When I'm saying that, what I mean is I think some pastors can't conceive of what might occur. And the truth is that a statement like this really enables abusers.
Oh, for sure. But in every context, the only thing a pastor should be saying is you are just as important as your husband. And when it comes to sex, you have a right to do what you feel comfortable with. And he needs to respect that, or he's raping you.
Yeah. So this was something that really stood out to us because it was about a half of the women talking about their sexual experience lacking emotional intimacy. One woman described it throughout our marriage, there was not a lot of intimate emotional connection. So I felt lonely a lot. Having sex without emotional connection, I don't think is really generally super healthy. I think a lot of times I actually use sex to feel connected. So you see these women are really feeling quite desperate to connect and hoping that they'll be able to get that emotional intimacy through sex, and then really just never being able to feel the emotional intimacy that can accompany a healthy sexual relationship. The next theme is related to this, and that is mourning sexual loss. So 1/3 of the women reported that due to their husband's pornography use, he would not or could not engage with her sexually. And obviously that takes a toll on her in regard to her self-esteem, her body image. A lot of them had mentioned that the frequent masturbation prohibited him from being able to connect sexually. And, one woman talked about how she got married when she was really young and she thought, I'm pretty cute, right? Why is he not able to sexually perform? This happening at quite young ages and being pretty confused about that. I think it's interesting because sometimes the narrative is she's not interested in sex. That's why he does this. His behavior is a reaction to hers. And you actually see a lot of women really mourning the sexual connection that they thought they would have in marriage. Saw that as well.
Yes. And they could not believe that religious leaders didn't tell them that that might have been an outcome, especially those who'd known about the porn before. They just understood once we get married, it'll all be okay. But they were like, wait a second, this is important information to know that there will be no sexual experience between us for years on end. Why was this information not shared?
So the next sub-theme is about a male-centric sexual experience. A lot of women talked about how a lot of times the marital sexual experience was really focused on the husband's preferences, and that this had been influenced by societal norms, religious scripts, and pornography as the primary form of sexual education for their partner. So sex was focused on his pleasure instead of her pleasure. And in some cases, they talked about, reflecting back and seeing a sexual grooming process. And Cassie shared in particular, clearly I could see looking back, but there was a progressive erosion of my own values when it came to sexuality, doing things in an increasing level of desperation to fix things. It's important that all people involved were really aware of how important it is to create space for women to develop their own sexual values, their own sexual preferences, and not continue doing what the husband wants. So the last sub-theme is sexual abuse in marriage. So a lot of the participants recognize the different forms of abuse that they had experienced in the marriage, whether there was aggression, control, lack of consent, marital rape. It took quite a bit of time and processing to recognize what had happened. One woman, this is Ruth, she shared there was a lot of unwanted touch, rape, not rape in the way you think about him, like forcing himself on me, but like being asleep and him doing whatever he wanted. I learned a lot about abuse and what abuse looks like. So I think a lot of women really just had no, like you've talked about, Anne, no abuse education and really didn't know what it was when it was happening, but they were able to process that later. One other participant shared about her experience. This is Anna. She shared, he started getting very verbally abusive and cussing and yelling at me. But I was always told that, as a religious woman, you just need to do what your husband wants. I didn't at the time, didn't know that it was considered rape. Now that I'm out of that and everybody's like, well, did you give consent? I was like, no. I said no many times. Then that's not consensual. That quote is really powerful. It can seem clear to us on the outside as she retells this, but I think it's really important to recognize that a lot of these women have been in this marriage for a while, and they've been in contexts where they really have not been able to clearly see the ways that they've been abused. And so it is so crucial that they tell their story, because if you assume that abuse couldn't be there, which I think some people just think porn is such a normative behavior, there wouldn't be abuse, but there is, and you really don't want to miss that.
Thank you so much, Rebecca and Heidi, for sharing your findings today.
Really appreciate the opportunity to let women know that research is starting to back up what their experiences are, and we appreciate what you're doing at BTR to help the women as well.
We really appreciate you having us, Anne. Thank you so much.
If this podcast is helpful to you, follow or subscribe on your favorite podcasting app to help other women find it. You can also subscribe to this podcast on YouTube. While you're there, comment, give it a 5-star rating. That'll help bump us up in the algorithm. Thank you to those of you who have subscribed on YouTube or other places and commented and given us 5-star reviews, because that's the #1 way to get the word out to other women about this. If you've already purchased a copy of my book, Trauma Mama Husband Drama, from Amazon, please circle back and give it a 5-star rating. A lot of women are searching for books to figure out what to do about their husband, and rating Trauma Mama on Amazon will help them find this podcast, which is free to everyone. And of course, your generous donations keep this podcast going. Go to btr.org, scroll to the bottom, and click on Support the Podcast. And until next week, stay safe out there.